Hello and welcome back to Particular Pixels. I'm Sheldon and this is my review of Hogwarts Legacy PC. I've never had much of an interest in the Harry Potter series. I didn't read the books, and in fact, I hadn't actually watched most of the movies until recently, and that was to specifically prepare for the launch of the game in order to try and do a more informed review. Naturally, I had a healthy dose of skepticism, especially with the history of current releases these days, and also with Avalanche software being relatively unknown and also never having done anything even close to this scale previously. Well, I've finished the campaign along with a large number of the side activities, putting me at around 65 hours in total, and here are my thoughts. Hogwarts Legacy is set in the late 1800s, quite some time before the movies take place. You play as a fifth year student who holds the key to an ancient secret that threatens the wizarding world. There are several story arcs that run alongside the main one as you make your way through the campaign, where you'll be dealing with goblins, poachers, and dark wizards, all revolving around different characters. It keeps things varied and interesting. As usual, I'm not going to go into any details about the story here, but suffice to say, I enjoyed it. The various arcs, while not the most original, were entertaining enough to carry me all the way through to the end without me losing interest or momentum. Visually, Hogwarts Legacy is a treat. The amount of detail they've put into creating Hogwarts itself is especially impressive. Hogsmeade and the world at large, while not quite at the level of Hogwarts, are also nice looking. Avalanche have done a fantastic job of recreating the atmosphere and locations portrayed in the films, something I actually hadn't expected from the relatively unknown studio. The voice acting was also pretty decent, as was the lip syncing for the most part. There were some issues here and there, but never enough to distract me from the experience. I found the music to be particularly fitting with its highs and lows, working well with the theme and visuals, and I really enjoyed the various tracks throughout my time with the game. Hogwarts Legacy is an open world RPG, or perhaps RPG Lite is a better description, formulaically similar to what one would find in most typical open world games these days, especially regarding exploration and itemization, but it's rather superficial as far as depth goes. A main quest line, side quests scattered throughout, and a large world map full of icons to chase. The game starts off relatively slowly, with lots of cutscenes and dialogue, and gradually introduces the mechanics over the first hours. You'll pick a house at some point, which doesn't really change much, save for a few quests, some other dialogue options, a different common room, and a house robe that you can unlock for the most part. You'll be learning new combat and utility spells at various points throughout the story via assignments, unlocking the Room of Requirement, which allows you to grow herbs for potion ingredients or brew potions, identify and upgrade gear, and also keep Wild Beast, which provide you with materials to upgrade said gear. I'll talk a little bit more about the Room of Requirement later. At some point, you will also unlock the ability to fly around on a broom, which can subsequently be upgraded. Aside from combat, there are a number of puzzles, a few broom races, an Accio ball minigame, a ton of treasure caves, and some other collectibles and challenges to find, which will reward you with cosmetics for your gear, your broom, furnishings for your Room of Requirement, as well as traits that give you better defense against specific enemy types. You'll be running around casting Revelio a lot, which highlights hidden items. Now, X-ray vision in many games doesn't make any sense, at least I suppose in Hogwarts Legacy it's less unbelievable due to the setting of the game. Doing activities and combat net you XP, which levels you up, and awards talent points, which can be put into one of the available talent trees. That's spells, dark arts, core, stealth, and Room of Requirement. Now, not all these talents seem useful. I found the stealth and Room of Requirement tree to be the least interesting of them all. And once I hit level 40, which is the max, I had almost all the skills that I wanted. Also, there seems to be zero consequences to using dark arts in the game and its related tree. The combat itself is not particularly deep, but I found it to be both enjoyable and engaging. It has a sense of weight and impact, although a hardcore difficulty mode would have been welcome for those of us who wanted more of a challenging experience. There are a variety of enemies that need to be dealt with, most having some kind of weakness that you can use to your advantage. For example, a Dugbog tongue attack can be interrupted by casting Leviosa and then casting Diffindo, killing it instantly. Most humanoid melee enemies can have their weapons taken away with Expelliarmus and thrown back at them. I've probably butchered the word there. All of these weaknesses are outlined in the enemy description cards you find when encountering an enemy for the first time, so it pays to read through each of these so you're prepared for each encounter. Humans and goblins will also shield themselves with Protego, a shield in one of three colors, yellow, red, or purple, that will basically absorb any damage directed at them. So you'll need to break these shields first by casting a corresponding colored spell or using ancient magic to throw an object at them to break it before actually being able to do any damage. As a player, you are able to block normal attacks by pressing or holding Q to cast Protego. Holding Q not only blocks an attack but also stupefy whatever enemy you currently have targeted. Finally, you are able to dodge roll, which is required to avoid unblockable attacks. The dodge can also be upgraded to a dash, allowing you to travel further when evading attacks or moving around the combat area quickly. Blockable enemy attacks are telegraphed as an orange ring around your character's head, and unblockable attacks by a red ring. So it's pretty easy to see when you are about to be attacked, even by enemies that are not currently on the screen. Having to juggle spellcasting, dodging, blocking, breaking shields, and disarming enemies kept the encounters interesting. Some encounters were a little more challenging than others, but as I said earlier, none of them were actually difficult per se, especially once I understood the mechanics. There were no instances where things were unfair or where I felt that the game was using cheap tactics. Some areas can also be approached stealthily, and some missions do require it, but it's a small part of the game, in my opinion. You can, of course, sneak into bandit camps as well to take them out one at a time if that is your preferred playstyle. Aside from the overall lack of difficulty, I do wish there was more enemy variety and that the open world had more combat encounters scattered throughout. If I had to leverage a larger complaint about the combat, it would be that the flow is hindered by the UI and the lack of available hotkeys for spellcasting, which I'll talk about a little later. There are also a few plants that you can grow that can be used in combat. I barely used these in my playthrough since casting spells did a perfectly good job, and I never found that I needed to supplement my combat with the use of these plants in order to manage it, but it is an option for you. There are also a number of puzzles in the game found in many of the campaign quests, side missions, and open world sections. The puzzles are pretty easy, but your character seems to enjoy blurting out hints constantly, never shutting up basically, not giving you any time to actually figure stuff out. I don't really feel the need to be handheld in games, so as a result I did find this particularly annoying. Later in the game you'll also learn Alohomora, the lockpicking spell. There are 3 levels to the spell, allowing you to open level 3 locks eventually. The minigame for this gets pretty repetitive pretty quickly, and you are going to be forced to do this minigame every single time you want to lock any door in the game. Every lock, no matter what the level is, has the same minigame. It doesn't get any harder and it doesn't get any more complex either. I don't see why they didn't just allow the minigame to be skipped entirely, or at least allow you to auto-pick any locks that are below the level of your current Alohomora. There is a mod though that removes this minigame. The map is divided into 3 parts: Hogwarts, Hogsmeade, and the open world. Exploring Hogwarts, at least for the first several hours, remained interesting for me. There was a ton of detail and plenty of secrets to find in the large and detailed location, which kept me busy, digging into every nook and cranny to find all the treasure and various other secrets scattered about. Hogsmeade was well made, but less interesting to explore. Aside from the few stores that you'll be visiting, the rest of the town is basically made up of houses that can be explored once you get the Alohomora spell to pick the locks. And that's really about it. You find maybe a chest or two, some collectibles, and perhaps some coin. The open world is probably the worst offender of all these 3. At first it looks awesome, vast, richly detailed, and something that you'd want to explore. However, I soon realized that it was relatively empty, and exploring beyond marked icons on the map served no real purpose. There are enemies scattered about, as I alluded to earlier, but there aren't a great deal of them. There are also no dynamic open world events that you happen across while you travel. So as a result, it wasn't really long before I just made sure to unlock fast travel points so that I could fast travel around the map to get to quests or whatever else I needed to collect or get done. There are a number of small towns around the map, basically smaller versions of Hogmeade essentially, and like Hogmeade, they are just locations with houses that can be looted if you have the appropriate level of Alohomora, or there are also places where you can find vendors and sometimes quest givers. Something that struck me as pretty odd is that people never seemed to care if I went into their houses and took all their stuff. There was never a comment or even a reaction in most cases. Other than that, there are bandit camps, Merlin trials, which are puzzles with a few different varieties that when done will eventually unlock more inventory space for your character. There are treasure caves, which unfortunately are mostly copy pasted, so you'll be repeating the same layout quite frequently indeed. And there are a few other points of interest to explore, which I'll leave for you to discover. I think so much more could have been done with the open world in Hogwarts Legacy, and while it's not inherently bad, I think it's perhaps just a little uninspired. The UI is probably the worst aspect of the game. It's clearly designed for gamepads. Most of it is passable, but the spell menu is just horrid. You have 4 slots in each row, accessed by the numbers 1 to 4. You can unlock an additional 3 rows via talent points, giving you a total of 16 spell slots, which on paper sounds great. The problem is that even with all the slots unlocked, you won't actually have enough space to equip all the spells that you need to use regularly, so you'll have to constantly switch out various utility spells depending on what you want to do. The issue is made worse in combat. You'll need to constantly cycle between these spell bars to access the various spells. It is pretty cumbersome, and on PCs that have access to an entire keyboard and also mice that can have upwards of 17 buttons, I don't understand why the player needs to be limited to 4 slots that can be cycled and only 4 buttons that can be hotkeyed. At least allow all 16 slots to be hotkeyed, not just 4 of them. MMOs have existed with this functionality for decades at this point. Most of the icons and overlays can be disabled on the minimap as well. I chose to do it for the first several hours of my playthrough since it created a greater sense of exploration in Hogwarts. However, there is no such option for the world map. So every icon is always displayed once you go near a point of interest in the world. And what ends up happening is that the world gets cluttered with icons throughout your playthrough, and at least for me, this entirely removed any incentive to explore the world organically and resulted in an icon chasing minigame loop. Finally, the loot inventory menu is also rather clunky. You'll be collecting a ton of gear during the game, a lot of which is pretty useless and needs to be sold. Towards mid-game, when you have a larger inventory full of gear, there's no way to sell it all very easily. You are required to sell one at a time by clicking and holding your mouse button for, I think it's like 2 seconds or something. You are required to do this quite frequently, otherwise you won't be able to pick up any more loot. And again, I don't understand why developers don't add quality of life features like filters and sell all options, especially when a game has so much gear. Itemization is arguably the weakest system in Hogwarts Legacy. You'll be finding and replacing your gear so frequently that finding new gear basically loses its value. A lot of the time, a new piece of basic green gear will be better than the legendary orange gear you collected earlier. For the first part of the game, at least until you've unlocked the loom, you'll pick up whatever gear has the highest offense regardless of color. Once you get the loom, it allows you to upgrade your gear, so the offense defense that is higher, and you can also put in a trait. Better gear can hold a higher level trait. Higher traits have better bonuses, naturally. However, I found that the gear didn't really have much of an impact in the early game. And by the late game, when you can fully upgrade your legendary gear, it's not really necessary, since whatever gear you had before will probably be fine anyway, and you'll likely be steamrolling encounters regardless. The stats are just not particularly meaningful. It's sort of bloat with small numbers, like this is 1% better than the last thing. The same can be said for the various traits in the game. Think gems that enhance spells or defense against certain enemies. Admittedly, some of them are pretty useful, but many of them are just not worth using due to the game not being hard enough to actually warrant it. Practically though, gear seems more like a way to unlock new cosmetic options. At this point, another issue manifests itself. I found most of the cosmetic options made my character look like a I found that most of the cosmetic options made my character look like a clown, but I do suppose that's going to boil down to personal taste. It would have been nice to be able to set up a cosmetic template or for the game to just keep my current look and swap out the gear. As it stands at the moment, every time you switch out a piece of gear, you'll need to reassign what visual appearance you want it to have. And there are 6 gear slots that you're going to be doing this with incredibly frequently. It just seems like a lot of unnecessary busy work. You can also customize the look of your broom and will find a variety of one-handle cosmetics that you can choose from as well, but they have no impact other than the visuals. The Room of Requirement unlocks during the storyline and is a place where you can grow herbs, brew potions, and collect wild beasts, as I mentioned earlier. I don't want to spoil too much here, but you can decorate it with all manner of furnishings and styles which you will either find or can purchase, which unfortunately serves no purpose other than it looks cool, aside from the items that actually craft, grow, or create stuff, obviously. To get beasts, you'll need to capture them at certain locations and times of the day on the world map, and we'll need to have unlocked the nab sack. Different beasts provide different materials. There's a simple minigame in order to catch them. Rarer beasts have just a longer version of this minigame. Each vivarium can only house a certain number of species, and you can sell the excess beasts in your knapsack at a store in Hogsmeade if you don't want to keep them. Now, at the risk of sounding like a poacher myself, the capture and sell strategy is actually not a bad way to earn some decent income if you're short on cash. Growing plants, brewing potions, and harvesting materials from wild beasts are on a real-time cooldown. So, for example, to harvest materials from beasts, you'll need to feed and brush them. Once that's done, you can collect whatever material they give, and then there's a 25-minute cooldown, something like that, until you can do it again. A similar system exists for growing plants, but it's significantly shorter. You will eventually have more than you need for all these ingredients. You can have animals breed as well, but the young ones never actually grow into adults for some reason, which is kind of odd, but still they yield the same amount of materials when fed. As with every other system in the game, at first it appears like it has a lot of depth until you realize that it kind of doesn't. Grow plants to make potions, feed bees to get materials to upgrade your gear. That's pretty much the gist of it. The rest is all cosmetic in the room of requirement, and you will have more potions and upgrade materials than you know what to do with eventually. At launch, the game suffered from all manner of performance and stutter issues for a lot of people. I think I was pretty fortunate though. On my PC, it was smooth all the way through, minus a few loading stutters, which seems commonplace these days. On an older system I tested it on, which met the recommended requirements, it was basically unplayable, with constant 2 to 4 second pauses. Upgrading to 32 gigs of RAM on the system made the game playable, but the pauses still happened every now and again. These issues seem to have mostly been fixed now, and the game is far more playable than it was at launch on that system, but there are still occasional frame rate issues. I believe ray tracing still suffers from some problems. I did not play the game with ray tracing enabled on my 38. As far as bugs go, I had one instance where I needed to reload a save because after diving underwater for some gear, my character never resurfaced. I think the deep took him. There were a few times when there were lighting and graphical glitches, not very often though. NPCs walking into objects and getting stuck, and loot behind other items making them impossible to collect. These are the main ones that come to mind. I didn't have any crashes or majorly severe bugs that hindered my experience overall, thankfully. If one were to remove the Harry Potter themed coat of paint, Hogwarts Legacy would be a pretty standard open world game that doesn't venture to try anything particularly new. However, while the individual parts of Hogwarts Legacy don't stand out as deep or particularly groundbreaking, this is one of those cases where I actually found the sum of its parts to be far more enjoyable than I ever would have expected it to be. The game also supports mods, of which there are already plenty, which is a great start. If I do have another criticism, it's that it's not very replayable, and what I mean by that is that a second playthrough would not be all that different if that's something you are expecting. There are little to no changes based on the choices you make overall, and even trying new builds wouldn't offer a significantly different gameplay experience. That said, I'll likely revisit it in a few months from now, unless there's some new content before that. If you are looking for a relaxing and enjoyable open world game to sink your teeth into, Hogwarts Legacy will likely scratch that itch. Coming from a non-Harry Potter fan, I think it's actually a competent and well-made game, has a decent amount of content, and is definitely worth playing if you haven't already. Anyway, that about sums up everything I have to say about Hogwarts Legacy. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope some of you found it helpful. If you do have any questions or comments, you can leave them down in the section below. Thanks for watching. I've been Xiaoling, and I'll see you next time.